The participle. Is it making you ill to look at all those forms of the participle? I understand. Why do we need so many forms of the participle? In English, a participle is just one word. Jumping, running, the ing words, right? They're straightforward. So why so many forms for this lowly participle? Well, do you remember when we learned the article in Greek? And we looked at another chart and we thought, what is going on with this? 24 forms of the article. In English, we just have the one, the, right? So why do we need 24 of them? Well, as we learned, Greek morphs around a lot so that every article matches the noun it modifies in case, number, and gender. So that multiplies out to 24 different forms of the lowly article. Well, it's the same with participles. Participles are verbal adjectives. And so as adjectives, they have to be able to be 24 different forms to match every case, number, and gender of every noun that they attach themselves to. Now that might seem a little terrifying, but the good news is that the clues that we've learned to identify case, number, and gender for all the other substantives apply to participles too. Remember this one? Oh, the sea of pronouns. And that whole page and a half of the master chart just devoted to remember 11 words. Why so many forms? To illustrate a point. That Greek follows these patterns to show you case, number, and gender of every substantive. And again, the participle is like that. It's a verbal adjective, and so it will show you its case, number, and gender. And it has to be able to be masculine and feminine and neuter because participles will modify all kinds of nouns. Yeah! But again, the good news, we know the patterns. So this is kind of like review. We're not really learning anything new. We're just reviewing stuff we already know, right? The present participle, like all participles, will have tense and voice, case, number, and gender. So how do we recognize the tense of a present participle? You probably can guess already. Present tense stem, right? The one that you learned. It will be unadulterated. There it will be. Just nice and regular, just like you learned it. So again, the clue for the present, there is no clue. Now, how will we know the voice of a participle? Okay, now here's the one new thing you have to learn. The participle uses little letters called participle morphemes that tell you, hey, I'm a participle, and they also tell you the voice of the participle. Well, these little letters are not, don't let that scare you, because it's really pretty cool, it's pretty easy. In the middle passive voice, all participles will use men as the clue, and we'll see this as we look at the chart here in just a little bit. And in the active voice, participles in the masculine and neuter will use neutau, and in the feminine, they'll use usa. So those are the clues that we will look at to determine the voice. Now, how will we know the case, number, and gender? Well, I've already said, by the personal endings. And so we will see that in the active voice, that the participles follow the 3-1-3 pattern of declension. And in the middle passive voice, the participles follow the 2-1-2 pattern of declension. It would probably be worth it for you to go back and re-watch videos 12 and 13, which are about 2-1-2 adjectives and 3-1-3 adjectives, and just remind yourself about how those are formed, because it's exactly the same thing with the participles. If you understand 2-1-2 adjectives, you'll have no trouble with the middle passive participles because they follow exactly the same pattern. You'll see that. They look just like the article, right? And if you understand 3-1-3 adjectives, you'll have no trouble with the active voice participles because they follow a 3-1-3 pattern. Just like pos, remember? Pos, posa, pawn. So go back and look at videos 12 and 13 if that's a little fuzzy for you. Hey, it's better than reruns, or, fall lineup isn't that good. So go back and rewatch those videos if you're, growing a few cobwebs over those concepts. It'll be really important to see those things as we get into the participles here. So in this video, we'll take a look at how present participles are formed. So we'll zoom in and take a look at all this stuff I'm telling you. And then I want to go on and show you how present participles are used in Greek sentences. Open your master chart to the participles page, page 7, And hopefully this won't terrify you, because what you'll see is, wow, look at all these forms, but really we're just looking at making the changes that we already know how to make. So even though there are lots of forms, that's just because we're looking at the case, number, and gender, and tense and voice of this word, and it's able to change to give you all that information. But the way it changes is perfectly regular, as we will see. Here we zoom in on the present participle. And notice, okay, we have all these forms. How will we translate all of this? Well, in English, it's very simple because English participles don't change form to give you the case, number, and gender. In other words, this entire box would simply be translated loosing, okay? And over here in the middle passive, all of these forms would just be translated being loosed. Or if we were doing middle, it would be loosing for self. But why all these forms? Again, because the participle in Greek gives you a lot more information than the participle in English. It tells you the case, number, and gender in the same way that the article tells you the case, number, and gender, and therefore there are so many forms. Okay, so it's just grammatical information. That's all. But the translation of the active participle is simply loosing. Now, if it's referring to a feminine subject, it would be luusa. If it's referring to a masculine subject, it would be luon. But in English, just loosing. Okay? So almost like too much information. That's our problem here with the Greek. I know I'm being very repetitive here, but I really want to drive this point home. Remember that with the article, all of these translations just mean the, right? But we have 24 forms to show us the case, the number, and the gender. Same thing with the participles. Let's start with the middle passive form of the participle here because it's really very easy to recognize. It's the 2-1-2 pattern, and it will always have men in the middle. So let's zoom in. So the middle passive participle, it just means being loosed, or if it's middle, loosing for self. Okay, so why all these forms? Again, case, number, and gender of everyone. Let's just go through. How do I know this is a present participle? Because the stem has not changed. There it is, just like you learned it, lu. How do I know that it's a middle or passive participle? Because of this participle morpheme, men. Notice it's in every single one of them. How will I know the case, number, and gender? By the personal endings. And you'll notice I've included the article for purposes of comparison here. Notice that the endings are just what we've learned. U, ace, u, for example, in the genitive. Here's u, ace, and u. Just please compare the datives, o, a, o. The accusatives, on, ain, and here ta or on. But we've seen that that's typical. The case ending is on, right, for the accusative. Here we have oi, I, and ah. So please just look at how similar these are. And the point is that as you're reading along, you want to know the case, number, and gender of the participle. Well, hopefully you recognize these endings because they look just like the article. The active participle, let me remind you, just means loosing. All of these forms just mean loosing. But depending on whether it's tied to a masculine or a feminine or a neuter subject, or whether it's acting as the subject or the object or the indirect object, these are the reasons for all these changes. Again, Greek is giving you more information than we're used to.
TMI, Miss Girl.
In English, you translate every one of these loosing. Okay, well, how do we know that it's a present participle? Oh, do I need to say it again, right? You just recognize the present tense stem. It hasn't changed. How do I recognize that it's an active participle? Well, the big clue will be nu tau. And anytime you see this nu tau, think, oh, participle. Especially when you see a nu tau and what looks like a noun ending on the end. Now, you might have noticed that that nominative singular masculine form is an oddball, and it just is, which is why I've highlighted it. Now, the dative plural in the masculine and neuter are a little odd, but we've seen that oddness before. Now you'll look over here, you'll notice I've given you pos as a place to compare. Pos is a 3-1-3 adjective. And this participle is behaving just like a 3-1-3 adjective. Please look at the endings. Own, well, that's weird. Here it's sigma. But then we have os, e, a, s, on, si, os. Well, look at this. Os, e, a, s, on, si, os. Just exactly the same. And in the feminine, it follows first declension, and if you'll compare, you'll see that the endings are exactly the same there. And in the neuter, the endings are exactly the same as well. Nu, os, e, on. So here we have nu, os, e, on. And then the alpha for the accusative plural neuter. And then on, si, a. So if you learned pos, you already know how to tell the case, number, and gender of an active participle. And again, how do you know it's active as opposed to middle passive? These clues, nu tau, usa, or in the neuter as well, nu tau. As a side note, in case you're interested, the reason that the present participle follows the same pattern as pos is because in the masculine stem, it ends with a consonant. And remember that we learned this with the case endings, that the vowels that ended, whose stem ended in a consonant, followed third declension. So in the masculine, it was pont. Well, in the participle, this nu tau causes it to end in a consonant as well. But remember, in the feminine, it was usa, right? So it ends in an alpha. And in pos, it was pasa. So that's why we follow first declension. And in the neuter, again, we have the nu tau going, so that's why we need third declension. So there are reasons for these things. Not super important to know the why, but just in case you were curious. Now let's take a look at an example of an adjectival participle, and I'll show you how all this works. You're going to love this, okay? Here we go. Ida ha-amnas tu tha'u ha-iron tain hamartian tu kosmu. Okay, Ida is behold. Ha-amnas tu tha'u. Amnas is lamb, so amnas tu tha'u is Lamb of God. Behold, the Lamb of God. Ha-iron, taking away. Here's our participle right here, iron. Taking away. Tain hamartian tu kosmu, the sin of the world. Now this entire phrase right here is called the participial phrase, the one taking away the sin of the world, and it modifies the Lamb of God. Notice how we've seen this pattern before. Article, substantive. Article, modifier. But in this case, the substantive is a whole phrase and the modifier is a whole phrase. The Lamb of God, the one taking away the sin of the world. Okay, well, look at this participle here. Iron comes from iro. Now, how do we know the ending? Well, this is that nominative singular masculine ending. And as a matter of fact, this omega noon ending is very common because lots of times you have nominative singular masculine subjects. Now, one nice little thing is that anytime you have an article that is used to modify the participle, well, the case number and gender of the article will match the case number and gender of the participle. So if you have the article, it's really easy to see the case number and gender. Now, how do we know the tense and voice here? Well, the tense, notice that the stem has not changed. Iro became iron, so this is present. And how do we know the voice? Well, we just have to recognize this omega noon ending, that's that odd present form. So it's a present active participle, nominative singular masculine. Notice that it's present, and that in English that gets lost a little bit. The Lamb of God, it doesn't just say that he does it in an undefined way. When John points to Jesus, he said, this is the Lamb of God who is taking away. I mean, it's an ongoing present tense thing. He's taking away the sin of the world. So this is an adjectival participle. Notice that the taking away, nominative singular masculine, is pointing to the lamb, which is also nominative singular masculine. So it all matches, just as we would expect with this beautiful, logical Greek language. Here is a participle being used substantively. In other words, it's acting like the noun of this sentence. Hoi pistuantes so theis antai. Now, maybe you remember this one, theta, eta, sigma, future passive, right? And then the antai is the third person plural, so they will be saved. From sozo, right? I save. So theis antai, they will be saved. Oh, Greek verbs, what a miracle. Okay, but let's look at this participle. Hoi pistuantes, the believing. Now, how do we know that's a participle? We're going along and we're reading. Well, for one thing, it has an article. Verbs don't have articles like this, right? Another clue, though, the big one is nu tau. That says, hey, I'm a participle. And look at this. It's got a noun ending on a verb. That's a participle. Now, it helps you in my text that I multicolor them. So that makes it really easy to tell participles. But they're a verbal adjective, right? Okay, so how do we know this is present? Well, because this pistuo has not changed. Pistiu, pistiu. So the stem has stayed the same. We have this nu tau, which tells us it's active rather than middle passive. Remember, if it's middle or passive, it will always have men in the middle. There's no men involved here. So this is active. The believing ones. Now, how do we know the case number and gender? Remember, this is third declension. And when we pop the third declension in, see the epsilon sigma here? S. That's our nominative plural masculine form. But hey, we had another clue here, which should make this really easy. Because remember, the article will always match the participle. So if we know that that's nominative plural masculine from our article memorization, we should also be able to say, oh, this is third declension, nominative plural masculine. No big deal. The believing ones shall be saved. Now, how do I know it's substantival? Well, there's nothing to modify. So, in fact, in English, I have to almost add a word. The believing men, the believing people, the believing ones will be saved. Or you could even say, those who believe will be saved. But Greek does this a lot, uses participles substantively. English doesn't do that so much. Greek does it a lot. The believing ones, see, and it's pointing to a nominative plural, masculine subject here. The believing ones shall be saved. And here is an example of a participle being used adverbially, like an adverb modifying a verb. Now let's look at this sentence. Tauta, these. Now we see here we have a near demonstrative pronoun being used substantively. So like these things, right? We would have to add a word. These, he said, second aorist from Lego, right? These things, he said, in synagogue, in the synagogue. Notice here that this is definite even though there's no article. Again, we have to get used to this idea that Greek doesn't use the article the same way as in English in many cases. These things he said in synagogue, didaskon, in Capernaum, Capernaum, teaching in Capernaum. He said teaching. So teaching here modifies how he is saying things, okay? All right, well, let's look at this participle here. How do we know it's a participle? Well, we recognize this weird ending, okay? On, which we need to get used to. This is that nominative masculine singular form that we'll see a lot because, again, we have a lot of nominative singular masculine subjects. So, and this is referring to whom? Well, to the he in this verb, right? He said these things, teaching. Probably this is Jesus, of course. So, tauta epen in synagogue, didaskon in Capernaum. Okay, so present tense, easy to see. Didask, did not change. The voice is easy because this own always means it's that weird active form we just have to get used to. And then the case, number, and gender, we know by own as well. I'll pop it up again. It's that nominative singular masculine oddball that you'll see a lot. Okay. Didaskon in Capernaum. So that's an example of an adverbial participle. I want you to notice something that's missing there. No article. Remember, the adverbial participle will never, no exceptions, never have an article. The adjectival and substantival participle will usually have an article. But enough with the theory. Let's look at some in the wild here. And if you would just notice, I've highlighted all of the present participles in John 1. There are quite a few. So participles are a fairly common part of speech that we'll have to get used to here. So let's start off looking in verse 9, where our first one appears here. Ein taphos ta'alethanon hafotidze panta anthropon. He was the true life which enlightens every man. Erchamenon eis tan kasman. Okay, erchamenon. Does that look like a participle to you? Do you see the men? Do you see the on? What does on look like? Hopefully that looks like to you by now. The accusative forms here, on right here. So we're looking at either a masculine or neuter. So this refers either to the light coming into the world or the man coming into the world. And actually it's a little ambiguous. It could be either one by the form, but probably it's the light here because we're talking about the light enlightening every man, and it's the light that's coming into the world. This one would be adverbial because there's no article. Notice that, no article before the participle. And so it enlightens by coming into the world. It enlightens coming into the world. So erchamenon, the coming, tells us a little bit more about the enlightening here. Now you might be a little bit confused here because this is a middle passive participle, right? So why isn't this being come into the world or coming for itself or something like that? Remember the root of this? Erchomai, right? It's deponent. So if it's deponent in the indicative mood, it's deponent in the participle too. Notice too that ercha, that this has not changed. Remember in the aorist it becomes eilphon. So this is a present, middle participle, actually in this case deponent, middle deponent, participle, accusative, singular, neuter. Now down in verse 12, you can see it says, as many as received him, he gave to them authority, tekna theou ganesthai, children of God to become, tois pistiu usin, eis ta anima autou, in the name of him. Who does he give this authority to? Tois pistiu usin, to the believing ones. Now, you can recognize pistiu usin from pistuo. Notice it hasn't changed. It's a present participle. And you recognize that ending perhaps here as the dative plural. And in this case, notice it matches the article. Because it has an article, it's either adjectival or substantival. And in this case, the believing ones are modifying them. He gave to them authority. Who are they? They are the believing ones. Then in verse 15, look at this. John is bearing witness peri autou concerning him, kai kekragon. He has cried out, saying, there it is, legon. That's our old familiar ending in the active. Remember that? Omega nun, legon. So he's cried out, saying, and in this case, no article. So it's describing the crying out. He cried out, saying, Hutos ein han epon, this is the one of whom I said, ha opisomu erchamenos, the one coming behind me. Now just take a look at that. You can see that looks like it's acting like a subject of a sentence, and it is. Here's the article, the one coming after me. So in this case, it's acting like a substantive here, like a noun. And again from erchamai. And we see the ending that this is nominative singular masculine, menas. Move down to verse 26, and there it is again. Apokrithe autois ha Ioannes. John answered them, saying, so legon, nominative singular masculine, to match John there. And here it's adverbial. He answered saying. We've seen that before. Here in verse 28, he said these things in Bethany on the other side of the Jordan, where ein ha Ioannes baptizon, where John was baptizing. Was is ein, baptizing. This combination of a to be verb and a participle is called periphrastic, but no big deal. Just understand that sometimes Greek does, just like English, was baptizing. That's just how we would say it in English. So again, because it's nominative singular masculine, there's our old ending again, on. And please notice that there's our root there from baptizo. So the present tense stem is sitting there staring you in the face. In 29, we see our old friend erchamai here coming again. Remember, it's deponent, so he sees Jesus coming to him and he says, Ida ha-amnas tu tha'ah, ha-iron tein hamartian tu kasmu. I think we looked at that one actually in our video, but there it is, okay? The Lamb of God taking away the sin of the world. Acting adjectively here. The Lamb, the one who takes away the sin. And here's our nominative singular masculine ending that we're learning to get used to here, this omega noon. A couple more great adverbial examples here. Here we have I came baptizing, so it describes the coming. Notice no article. Their nominative singular masculine form there. Nice, clear, present root, right? I came baptizing, or here, John bore witness, saying. So again, adverbial and nominative singular masculine to match with John. Omega noon. Getting the idea that that is indeed important. Omega noon, nominative singular masculine form of the participle. So what is it that John saw? He saw ta pneuma, the spirit, katabainon, hos peristeron, descending as a dove. So here we go, katabainon, from katabaino. So he has come to see the Spirit descending. Now look at this one. What does this go with? There is no article, so is it adverbial? I have come to see while descending? No, clearly John's not descending. The Spirit is descending. And we know that the katabainon cannot refer to John because John would be nominative singular masculine. But notice this one is neuter singular. So katabainon, descending. So in this case, we have an adjectival participle without an article. Remember I said that the adjectival and substantival participle usually have the article, but not always.
I mean, the holidays are tough enough without adding heartbreak to the mix.
Well, them some heavy words, Paul Blart.
Hey, life is heavy.
Yes, dim some heavy words, Paul Blart. But as we go along, we'll see that participles, yes, are heavy. They carry a lot of weight, but they're really worth their weight. They're really wonderful words that have a lot of flexibility that can do some quite amazing things in Greek sentences. So yes, heavy words, but well worth it.